Hello and welcome to my living room, uh, where we'll be broadcasting this event this evening with Sam Byers and Katharina Volckmer to celebrate their two books, Come Join Our Disease and The Appointment. Just to explain how it's going to work tonight, I'll give a little introduction about the two books, and then we'll have some readings from Sam and from Katarina, and then we'll have a conversation between the two authors, and at the end you'll have an opportunity to ask questions as well. So if you do have any questions at any point during the event, please do feel free just to put them in the comments box on the page as they occur to you, and I'll pop back in at the end to deal with them all at once. So yeah, just put anything in there as it occurs to you. Don't hold back. So Come Join Our Disease by Sam Byers follows a young woman called Maya who has offered an escape from homelessness in a Faustian bargain with a tech company. In exchange for their sponsorship, she must document her redemption on Instagram in order to generate social capital for the company. But when she meets an unemployed woman named Zelma at the doctor's, she begins to resist, eventually joining an alternative community of women who celebrate a lifestyle of debauchery, unchecked consumption, ugliness, illness, and decay. Maya becomes caught between two worlds and is trapped by the forces that she's unleashed. In the Sunday Times, Joanna Thomas Core described the book as a deeply admirable achievement that confirms Sam Byers as one of the most accomplished novelists of his generation, and that 20 pages from the end, a meditation on human disintegration and the love that can arise from sharing one another's decay moved me to tears. It felt piercingly wise and, dare I say it, beautiful. The Appointment by Katharina Volckmer we find ourselves inside the head of a young woman as she unburdens herself to a certain Dr. Seligman. Katarina, you'll have to tell me whether I pronounced that correctly. In a monologue that is both razor-sharp and subversively funny, she takes us on a wide-ranging journey from ultra-sexual fantasies and overbearing mothers to the medicinal properties of squirrel tails and the enduring legacy of shame. The Appointment challenges our notions of what is fluid and what is fixed, and injects a dose of Bernhardian snark into contemporary British fiction. Ian McEwan described The Appointment as dark and brilliant as The Naked Lunch, and mesmerizingly beautiful. So, on that beautiful note, I'm going to hand over to Sam Byers for a reading from Come Join Our Disease.
Hi everyone, thanks Sam. Welcome to my living room. I'm just going to read a short passage from quite late on in the book, and this is just a passage that takes place when Maya, the central character, has kind of left her regular workaday life and taken over like a kind of squat in a disused industrial building with a group of other women, and they're giving themselves over to the sort of forces of decay and ugliness, which is part of Maya's project of transcendental degradation. It's hard to say how long we'd been there when the heat wave hit. Like our skin, the walls, the floor, time had become slippery. Summer had become deeper summer. We were hot, sweating, lethargic. Then the weather turned fierce and we began to boil. We kept waiting for it to break, for a storm to erupt. Rain felt inevitable, but it never came. Instead, it began to feel as if the humidity could increase forever, until it was no longer possible to tell what was welling up from our glands and skin and what was condensing on our surface from the atmosphere around us. Even at night, the temperature barely dropped. Our will to move decreased, then our patience followed with it. We were soporific and ratty, lazy and quick to blow. The heat accelerated what we'd already set in motion. The piles of discarded or not yet consumed food began to rot more quickly, stink more pungently. As the liquefying meat and vegetables lost form and bled out into the pools of shit and piss that covered the concrete floor, smell was no longer a word that seemed to bear any relevance. The reek was a physical presence in the air, something you could feel on your skin and in your eyes, at the back of your throat and over your tongue as you breathed and spoke. Flies, already heavily present, now flocked to the space in clouds. At first we swatted at them, killed them if they were drowsy enough. Soon we simply acclimatized to them. Their choral drone became part of the atmosphere, the feel of their legs and wings on our skin, at the entrances to our ears and nostrils, became just another physical sensation amidst a symphony of sensations. Itchings and burnings and stinging rashes, and sticky pools in swelling, fatty folds. Quickly, the foil and plastic containers that had carried our food, as well as the larger chunks of meat that had fallen aside, writhed with maggots, which carried in turn their own distinct and filthy stench, slightly fishy, slightly earthy. The maggots, of course, saw no distinction between themselves and our detritus, and it began to seem as if not a day went by without someone discovering about their person some fresh new sore, a squirm with life. Vileness, like beauty, required maintenance. In the late afternoons and evenings, sloppy with what we'd consumed and contracted, we tended to each other's suppurations. Margot would bring her face close to mine, and I would squeeze her spots, one by one, enjoying the sudden subcutaneous explosion, the froth of yellow-white pus over my fingernails. Then I, in turn, would offer my back or thighs to Kim or Zelma, and one or both of them would dig with filthy fingers into the depths of one of my open sores, which by then were not painful but numb, scraping from the softened, spongy interior of the wound the wriggling activity it had attracted. I began to feel as if we were merging with one another. The process was more than simply emotional. It was biological, systemic. Each of our bodies was a biosphere, slick with bacterial and insect life. We teemed, and what we teemed with brought us closer not only to each other, but to the ecosystem we inhabited, fed off and nourished. Bacteria bred in the ooze of our waste, our discarded food remains and puddled shit, then travelled onto us and between us, carried not only on the thickened air, but by the fleas and lice that hopped and crawled from one body to the other. There is no difference, I began to think, between the puddles on the floor and the streaks of filth on my skin and the acne that had erupted on Margot's face. It was all just life, matter, the biome. We were leaking out into the world, and the pooled primordial essence of the world was soaking back into us in turn. I came to understand that this, truly, was what it meant to go back to nature, that this was nature in its truest form. No forests and campfires, no rolling hills and reassuring rambles, just rivers of shit and decay, a chamber in which we ate and shat and ate and shat and lived among the carcasses of all the things we didn't want and couldn't fully consume. The processes of the world were known to us. Nature, in all its foul and irresistible force, was not something to be sought and found. It was simply what thrived when you stilled yourself, when you abandoned the futile endeavour of holding it back. Thank you.
Hi there. I've actually picked a passage that I think corresponds in some ways to Sam's novel. And it's my protagonist thinking about love and blood and her former lover called Kay. Love often reminds me of blood, Dr. Seligman. Don't you think they are quite similar? Blood is only beautiful and full of symbols as long as it stays in its place. But once we see it smeared across someone's face or dried on a towel, we're put off because our mind immediately fills in the gaps with violence and a lack of control. Love, like blood, needs to be a story we can tell. If it breaks free from the picture frames and veins we have forced it into, it causes hysteria. And brutal attempts are made to put it back where it belongs, to contain what is contagious. For like love, blood gives life, but it is also home to all the things that can kill us, all that we're afraid of, all the diseases that Dracula had instilled in his rats. There's a hygiene of love, Don't you agree? Just like I cannot go smearing my blood around, like they have invented endless products to make sure women don't lose their dirty blood in public, I also cannot go around and just love where I see fit. The blood we see on the pavement could be anyone's. It's not immediately clear whether we are dealing with a person or an animal, and we don't even know how it got there. Whether there's a culprit or whether they turned against themselves because they just couldn't handle it anymore. Whether they used a weapon or simply their teeth. Blood on the pavement signals unrest, just like love outside the frame, a reminder of all the pain that is inevitably coming our way. And don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that I should be allowed to let loose in the playground. But we have such a clear idea of what a love story is, that if you go and try to find a different way to use your heart, they will say that you too have sick rats in your basement, and that you drank their blood when they least expected it. But it's their own fault, Dr. Seligman. If they had not tried to fit my body into one of their picture frames, to make me smile whilst nothing around me was true, I would never have tried to be like them, and Kay and I would not have needed all those other colors to paint another universe onto each other's bodies. Kay could cry like a child. He would sob and rub his eyes, and his bottom lip would protrude in defiance against the overall injustice of his fate. I don't know if he taught his children to do the same, or if he had learned it from them, but afterwards, he once told me that in those moments he actually felt like a child, like his body was little again, unable to escape the violence of others, the inevitable weakness of his own limbs, the force that forever outweighed his own efforts. The nausea you feel when your nose gets hit and you think you can smell your own blood. And so he had found a way out of his body, and even if it was painful, he knew that our flesh holds many lies, that we should never trust the stories we find written on our skin. I think that's why we had to find each other. The first time he cried, Dr. Seligman, I just watched him as he would a wild animal that has suddenly chosen to show itself and not run away. And as with an animal, initially I didn't move, offered nothing as cheap as comfort, but simply watched as he returned to his former self, shedding those big tears that rarely spring from an adult's eyes, those tears that still believe in adventures and shelter, those tears that think that fairy tales are true, that sleep tight in the knowledge that the darkness outside their windows isn't real, that it's just a part of their parents' imagination. And afterwards his eyes were so clean. I have no better way of putting this, Dr. Seligman, but they were never red. Instead they looked fresh, as if creation had only just happened, as if he had just unseen the world and the colors were suddenly all new to him, as if we could fall asleep every night knowing that our dreams would make us fly. Thank you.
Hi, Katarina.
Hello.
I love this novel so much, and the thing that leapt out at me from it was this kind of continual sense of the body both as something that contains us, but also something we're trying to free ourselves from, and which might hold the key to some kind of transcendence. And at one point towards the end, the narrator says, you cannot transcend your physical reality in your mind. And at another point, she imagines this almost sort of utopian space. Suddenly there were no continents, no surnames, no parents, no jobs, no children, and as far as it was possible, no bodies. And so I suppose my first question, my starting point, was whether you feel the body is a problem for us, and if so, whether we can transcend it and enter that kind of space.
That's a very good question. I think it is it can be a problem, certainly, I think. And I think what also interested me was that the body you're born into carries so many layers of significance, right? And obviously in the case of my protagonist, it also carries that layer of historical guilt, and that you are sort of born into a quote unquote German body, i.e. a guilty body. And I think that's the body that she wants to leave behind. But at the same time, I think it offers this opportunity for transformation, which I think also corresponds to your protagonist in many ways. And that's something I liked about your novel, is that you also have this focus on the body, and that it's not just in the mind. So I think it is something that I would say it's both. It's maybe the problem and the solution at the same time. That's probably how I would see it, because she's certainly embracing it as something that you can change, but whilst at the same time you can't. So I think for me it's a bit of both. I don't know how you feel about it with your protagonist.
Yeah, I feel the same in many ways. I feel that it's a kind of contested space,
Mm-hmm.
and I feel that no one wants to kind of deny the existence of the body. Like I don't think that works out well for people. We live in our bodies like we're with them our whole life. It's ridiculous to pretend that they're not a huge part of our existence. But I think they become a sort of we over-identify the body with the self, perhaps.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that is what leads to that feeling of wanting to expand past the body, which in a sense I think both of our protagonists kind of share. But I also wonder if it's because your protagonist feels, as Maya does in my book, I think this sense of it being difficult to fit into society, or not liking the world that she has to live in. And I wonder if there's this sense in which, because capitalism places so much emphasis on our bodies, and our bodies are like almost a resource, it's natural for people to want to reclaim the body when they feel in a sense that that's all they've got, all they can reclaim. If we can't reclaim space, money, all the other resources you want, it seems natural to me that the body becomes a sort of site of resistance, if that makes sense. And it seems to me in your book that's doubly true because of what you're saying about the body as a kind of repository of history as well.
Yes, and it's something I liked about your protagonist as well, that because I always feel like and that might also have something to do with capitalism, that we have a very clear idea of what a body is, and that the moment you kind of try to step out of that, people will be totally outraged, right? It's something I even find that with my novel, that, and maybe I deliberately chose not to read one of those passages. They love talking about Hitler and the sexy Hitler and all of these things, but they feel much more uncomfortable often to talk about. I mean, also the sexy Hitler is maybe funnier, but they find it, I think, more unsettling to talk about bodies and what she's trying to do with her body. And I have a feeling that might apply to your novel as well. And obviously what Maya does is much more extreme in many ways, but that she's also trying to step out of the concept we have of a sort of body as healthy and functioning and having a specific gender and all of those things. She sort of tries to go beyond that. And obviously, I don't want to spoil her too much, but she is met with a lot of resistance for trying to do that, isn't she?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's really interesting you say that those are the aspects of the book that people find more shocking. Like I read in an interview with you where you were saying that there is almost something in the way German people responded to the book, that it was they found it difficult to introduce the body into the subject of the Holocaust in German history. So, and I think there's something really interesting there about what is shocking, and the idea that things on a large scale are not shocking. you know, I saw someone saying the other day that, you know, when we think about what we describe as violence, for example, you know, it's a term we tend to use for something an individual or a small group of people do, and not for something that a nation does. And almost in that passage I just read out from your book, you're making a relationship between the body and a nation. You're almost suggesting that, which is something that I think, which nations kind of arise from the borders we experience in our body. And so I wonder if that's part of what's shocking for people, is this idea that in the end we can't separate ourselves, we can't separate our physical selves from the phenomena we experience in the world around us. And it's almost more comforting to say, well, that's environmental catastrophe, that's over there, that's history, that's over there, that's capitalism, that's just like a thing that's occurring, and not think about all the ways that those things are intimately connected to our physical form, because that would, I suppose, force us to think about the ways that we are involved in physically sustaining those things that are happening. And so I almost feel there's part of Maya's project that's like, if you begin with letting the body go, if you begin with personal decay, the inevitable result will be like almost like a sort of magical operation. It will be a much larger scale decay. And I wonder if that's part of the reason, you know, when we think about history or politics or things like that, we want to start with the structural and think about it as a really big thing. There's something very strange about how we don't want to think about it as an intimate thing, as a physical thing.
Yeah, or as an individual thing, right? And I think we do the things we do with our bodies, and if we you know, if anything, if we're violent or if we commit a crime, whatever, we do it with our body. So I thought that when discussing the sort of the legacy of the Holocaust, you can't really do it without talking about bodies and also how it affects people physically. I personally find that very interesting, but I know it makes people feel uncomfortable. I think also this idea that you are born into something you potentially cannot change, and that you have to accept that and you have to deal with that. You know, I think if you really sort of think about it, so it makes people feel uncomfortable, I think. And something else I was interested in your book, which again, I found there were so many parallels actually when I read your novel. There's so much to talk about. Was time, because at some point my protagonist sort of rants about time being organized around male bodies, which I think is largely true and an issue in our society. But then there was a passage where Maya also says that she misses this period of timelessness, and that she was worried about going back to time, and that I felt your book was sort of talking on maybe a larger scale on how sort of our sort of politics of time, or the way we do time, affects people's lives, and how I think that was something else she was trying to get away from, was the way we do time. Is that right?
Yeah, I think that's really true. I think there's you know, again, going to this thing of how our bodies are maybe contested space, and how they're, you know, the source of labor for other people. I think the way that time is imposed on us and we internalize time, it becomes very bodily. You know, like, you know, people always share those, like, you know, like daily routine, you know, what is a celebrity's daily routine, what is daily routine, what's it, and it's all around sleep and how much you eat and what you have for breakfast, and like when you have your smoothie, and then when you have a jog, and then, you know, and I think what it starts to feel like is your whole body and all your time is at the service of being this productive machine. And I think, you know, people used to sort of talk disparagingly about the 9 to 5, but now, I mean, the 9 to 5 is so long gone. You know, when I look at the sort of rhetoric around well-being and health, it feels like even your sleep is only something that helps you do more emails the next morning, you know, and like it's all at service of being productive. And I think that leads to a really strange conception of time where people, and you hear people saying this like all the time, it's like we don't have any time, like we no longer own any time, we're not experiencing time in a personal way. And it's been interesting actually through lockdown, you know, one thing I've almost found that I began to kind of enjoy is less calendrical time, and, you know, more of a sense of structuring time as I wanted to do it. And I think it's a really strange paradox, because in a way time comes from the body to begin with. We only really need, like, have a sense of time because time is arising from, you know, our body's natural rhythms, and also the fact that bodies appear, decay, and then die. You know, that is really where time's coming from. And so, yeah, it does seem to me that if we want to reclaim time, that itself becomes a very, very physical act. And I suppose what you're saying is that it's also a feminist act, because time is, you know, you're describing this kind of masculine idea of time. But I don't know if you feel there's a connection there between, I suppose my question would be, what would a non-masculine form of time look like and feel like?
Well, for instance, I'm thinking a lot about how, for instance, if you want to have a child, right? There's almost no way of doing that in a way that fits with the model of society that we have, and it's almost something that's being punished, right? Because it's sort of it's considered that something that's sort of unproductive and in your way, and I find that's a good example of how time is very much organized around male bodies and how they kind of function in our society. But so-called female bodies, they are confronted with all these obstacles because, you know, they can only give birth up to a certain point, and they'll have to fit this into sort of our narrative of productivity. And for me, that's always an example of, and also this, I think it's quite a masculine take on time, what you describe, that even the 9 to 5 seems slightly ridiculous now, right? And also what you describe in your novel, that this idea of productivity, that everything sort of becomes quite competitive, I think, and I think I think there's a sort of other, maybe more matriarchal vision of time that I can see. That's a bit more gentle and that doesn't put, I think, that, I don't know, can maybe, and again, I think female bodies or women are forced to be a bit more corporal in some ways, right? Because they're in some ways more reduced to their bodily functions, and they're the ones who can give birth and do all these things. And I feel like our concept of time doesn't really make space for that at the moment. I don't think. It's in a way less related to the body than it should be, I find.
It's almost like there's a difference between bodily time, this time, and, you know, part of that project is to convince us that capitalist time is actually bodily time. You know, don't worry, it just so happens that the working day and everything you have to do is actually your, you know, body's natural rhythm anyway, which I find slightly suspicious. But I'm always really interested in the idea as well that there's something like in the sense of non-human time, like a book I really, really love, like maybe my favorite novel, is Thomas Mann's The Magic Mountain, where he's able to access what feels like sort of geological time or cosmic time. And I wanted Maya to sort of have that sense in the book of whether we can we can actually even transcend what feels like bodily time and human time and enter that sort of what feels like timelessness, which is actually just, you know, the time scale of sort of eons. And I think there's an interesting relationship there in that we don't think of the world as our body. Like, we don't think of the environment as an extension of our body. We don't think about the space that we move in as an extension of our body. We don't think that anything that's happening to the environment arises because of anything we've physically done. And, you know, I suppose that's why I sort of feel that there is something quite radical about, you know, if we could think our way out of bodily time, if we could think our way out even of the time span of a lifetime or the time span of like a physical event. You know, I don't know what you feel about that.
Yes, I could feel that when I was reading your book, and I think that is very interesting. And that also, I felt there was towards the end of the book, I did think of martyrs a little bit. I don't know if that was intentional, but there is almost those last pages that the other Sam was also referring to, an almost spiritual element, I thought, to it, because she really tries to transcend, as you say, the sort of the bodily time, and I thought that was quite strong and very interesting to me. That you try. I don't know if that was intentional, but yeah, my brain thought of martyrs just a little bit because of also what she was doing to her body and how she was trying to overcome her body. I don't know if that was a deliberate reference or just my brain making that up.
Yeah, and I suppose also the question of if you go that far out of your physical existence, or if you're like contained, like your embodied existence, if you like, there's the question of like what is out there, like what you would experience and what you would get to. And like that was almost a bit of a surprise to me, you know, like having been on the journey of writing the book and following Maya through that journey, that I realized more and more and more that it was going to have to get to quite a sort of, I don't know about the word spiritual, like whatever.
But you know what I mean, no? By that,
no, exactly. There isn't another sort of simple word. We're sort of stuck with it, but some beyond human place. And it started to seem to me that like thinking about that space was also quite radical, because that was another way out of all the things we've been thinking about. And so if there's not a way out through the body, there's potentially a way out through like our sense of the body and the way that we imagine ourselves, I suppose is where I was getting to. And that does then get you to quite a sort of cosmic or spiritual or sort of God related place, because you're imagining the human from the perspective of the non-human, which I think is something we really, really struggle with. And I think that's why sometimes when you describe kind of like introducing the body into certain conversations, you know, I think that's why it feels uncomfortable for people, because that relationship between what we see as our life and like life, as in capital L life, is very uncomfortable for people. Like it's very sort of uncomfortable thing to consider. I think like our smallness or our irrelevance, or
yes,
it's interesting because I felt your narrator also experiences that in a much more personal way as well. And like it was another connection I saw between the books, was this feeling that almost that society is for other people, you know, which I think she experiences really, really strongly.
Yes, she does, I think, and she doesn't quite know how to function according to the sort of rules of society. And I think if you feel like you have a body that doesn't fit in with society, then your life becomes very difficult, right? And sort of has an impact on everything she does and everything she thinks, because she always feels like she compares herself to sort of Frankenstein's monster and all of these things. But at the same time, that gives you, I think, an interesting perspective and an important perspective if you sort of feel like you've kind of stepped outside of these things. But at the same time, I think it's the source of her sadness and her unease, and this kind of, because I think a lot of these social mechanisms are very brutal, right? and I don't know what it would take to change them, but she definitely, I think, suffers from that, and suffers from because I think also a body always, there's so many expectations around bodies, right? What they have to look like, what they have to do, how they can perform, all of these things. And if you reject that, I think it's a struggle. It's really hard. And and I thought that obviously was even though they do it in very different ways, but I thought that really was a parallel between the two novels.
It's interesting you talk as well about like the source of her sadness, because I really experienced this as a novel that moves very skillfully from quite kind of high comedic rage, I would say, and like, it's very, very funny, and it's also very, very acerbic, and it's like the narrator is venting all of this stuff, like, about Germany and Hitler and her past, but as you move through the novel, it feels like you begin to sort of push past that, and you begin to understand that is an expression of something else, this kind of deeper sadness. And something that really stood out to me in the book, there's a passage where she almost feels that if her anger is taken from her, like if she's forced into being too mellow, she'll be sort of diminished. In some way, which I had also thought about when I was writing Come Join Our Disease as well. And so there's this feeling that just as she has all these associations with her body, she's also holding these like certain emotional states as being signifiers of who she is and being really important to her. And I found that really fascinating, because it almost raised the prospect of, it made me think about, like, I'm reading this narrator and I'm making judgments about like her health, or her well-being, or her state of mind, and yet the kind of standards that we might hold someone to, like being a bit less angry or letting go of more things, might actually be to them like a kind of erosion of who they feel themselves to be.
Yes, I think so. And I think it's maybe also something that I think now with lockdown, a lot of people might have also struggled, I think, because they are suddenly confronted with themselves with a lot of layers, I think, stripped away, right? And that there is at the center of all of us, I think there is emptiness, and we always struggle to fill that emptiness with something, and she fills it with her anger. And I think the movement in the book is that she obviously, I think, also uses that anger as a tool to push people away, so they don't get to the center of what she's actually concerned about. So her anger is in some ways, I think, a tool, but at the same time, it's part of who she is. And I think she also enjoys it. I think of her as also enjoying her rants, winding up Dr. Seligman. And of course, she is, for a German to be in that kind of position to talk to someone who's Jewish so openly, that's totally unheard of. And so she's always kind of, I always think of her as someone who's on like a frozen lake, she's kind of trying how far she can go before she will sort of crash into the lake. But it's something I saw but with Maya, I thought it was interesting, because I think part of her wanted to disappear, right? But at the same time, she struggled with it. And something I also found interesting is that whilst they were sort of engaged with their project, it was very important for them to be seen at the same time. And I found that very interesting, this idea of, on the one hand, leaving her body behind and rejecting society, you know, the ideas we have about bodies, but at the same time she wanted it to be public, right? That's something I was quite fascinated by.
Yeah, that's a really interesting observation, and I think it's almost the idea of leaving a record, isn't it? And you could maybe make a connection there with writing or art or like other forms of expression, in that, you know, it's hard enough to get on board with the idea of some kind of diminishment of the self, or some kind of project of self-negation or self-erasure, and it's hard to think of that as potentially liberating. You know, it seems as if when you first think about it, that would be like the opposite of liberating. It would be negating. It would be kind of violent. It would be, but I think it's even more difficult to conscience the idea that if you did begin this process of self-negation and self-erasure, no one would see it happening.
Yes.
So, you know, we want to escape the self, and we do, in a sense, want to. There's a part of us that sometimes I think that wants to have less existence, because that would be easier. But we also fear no one noticing that we have less existence. And so I think Maya's caught between those dueling injunctions of like the only way out of her situation, you know, because she doesn't see another place she could ever really possibly be, is this process of self-negation. And yet she feels she has to make some sort of statement around that has to be documented in some way, or there has to be some kind of record. And you know, I wonder if that also goes back to what you're saying, as well as the body as a kind of archive or repository. You know, if you self-negate, or if you transform yourself to the point that the previous self didn't exist, you're also having some kind of impact on all the history that went into that self. And so by documenting that, you're creating a replacement history, I suppose, for other people. And so there's still a sense that you exist in that sense, I suppose.
Yeah, and I guess it's a history that you're in control of, right? Maybe as opposed to the previous history, which I guess is what my protagonist is trying to do as well, to kind of maybe create her own history, something that that was sort of her decision rather than the stuff she was born with. But I think, yeah, we are scared of not being seen, right? I think.
But also being seen, I think that's the problem.
Yeah.
It's difficult to know which we want, because the experience of being like very, very seen is actually quite painful. You know, it's what we tend to mediate against, and try and set up all sorts of filters so that, you know, that doesn't happen, because it's overly intimate. And yet, like you say, the feeling of not being seen at all, you know, is also really kind of like lonely and isolating, and brings with it this sense of like meaninglessness. And I suppose there's something there as well about making not just history, but literally making meaning.
Yes, I think so. And something else I was really interested in was vandalism, actually, because I feel like I like vandalism as a sort of idea of reclaiming public space. But again, I feel like she takes it one step further, because she in some ways vandalizes her own body, doesn't she? And I think my protagonist does something similar, though I don't think she vandalizes it, but she changes her body quite significantly. But I really enjoyed that about your novel, this idea of sort of vandalizing your own body as maybe a way of reclaiming something in society. So that was something I was interested in as well.
And maybe bridging that space, right, between the body and the world around us. And asking if there is as much difference between vandalizing the world and vandalizing ourselves as we think there might be. But that reminds me, actually, that I also wanted to ask what it was like channeling this voice for the time that you were writing the book? Because like I quite enjoyed inhabiting this person for a few years who is much more transgressive than I am, and able to do things that I would never do. And you were just saying that you like there's a characteristic to your narrator that's very subversive and interested in shocking people, and she's channeling all this rage. And was that kind of difficult process for you inhabiting that, or was it fun?
No, it was hugely enjoyable, actually. I love that voice. I don't know, I love writing her because it was just such a flow of doing it, and I can obviously relate to a lot of things she's sort of saying, and her anger. And no, I did enjoying that. It wasn't a struggle for me, actually.
I thought you might say that, because that comes across as you read the book, I think. Like, this sense of real like delight in inhabiting that voice. And I assume you had the voice to begin with.
Yeah, it did start. It did start with her and Dr. Seligman, actually. In my head, they belong together. The fact that she talks to him. But yeah, no, it was an enjoyable voice to write because of all the things she had to say.
Hey guys, I've reappeared from the from the audience to come onto the screen just to say thank you. It's been a really great conversation, but I did want to give a chance to for people to ask questions as well. Yeah, we haven't nobody's popped up yet, but to give people a chance to ask questions of their own, I thought I might ask one of my own and bring it back to kind of near to the beginning of the discussion. You were talking about capitalist time and bodily time, and I think there are so many parallels between your novels, but I think it was a great one to start from, because it's structured, I think, in both of your books, the way that you use time to kind of try and interrupt that, and to kind of I guess show the radical potential of fiction that does still exist, in order to try and point at that kind of power, that time grab by tech capitalists. And I wondered whether you kind of see a radical potential in the novel still, in that sense, structurally, in terms of time, and in terms of the way that, even when they're short, they're long in comparison to lots of other things. And whether, I don't know, whether there's like where you think that might go, or whether there's any other writers who you think are kind of using the novel as a kind of structural form to interrupt that time grab by tech capitalists.
Katarina, do you want to go first?
An easy question. It's like a softball one to get started.
I don't mind going. I mean, yeah, I think there are. I was thinking about this the other day, and I don't know if you mean from the perspective of reading novels or writing novels or both, and I don't know what you feel, Katarina, but I feel as a writer that working on novels is now probably the last thing left in my life that I work on over that kind of time frame, and there's something really special, I think, about a form which is the product of 2 or 3 or 5 or even 10 years thought. And increasingly, like, I think particularly in nonfiction, it feels like nonfiction is now responding to life as quickly as it can, like especially the sort of like smart thinking sort of end of nonfiction. And I think there's something about also the fact that the novel creates its own sense of time within itself, and so that when a person is reading a novel, they literally have to engage with a different time frame. A novel might span generations, or it might span. Katarina's novel is like all like one scene essentially, and so I think the novel's ability to bend time and inhabit time and represent time and also take time means that it does have quite a radical relationship with time for me, and I think that might be why we're feeling the novel as a form feels quite energized at the moment, and that might be part of what people are finding in it.
Yes, but I think that's very beautifully put. But I agree, and I think also I feel like the novel has had a bit of a comeback, hasn't it, over the past year? I think, and I think people do enjoy this, what it offers, that you can just sort of zone out and zone into something completely different. And I still think it's an experience that nothing else will give you, this kind of experience and this kind of intensity. For instance, so I read your book in a few days, and I really enjoyed reading it in such an intense way, like over like several hours. And there's not much else you do in that kind of concentrated way. And I feel like at the moment it's something that people are almost craving, with sort of the so-called death of the attention span. But I think at the same time, it's something that people rely on, and that is also a source of it's the same time I think a source of comfort, but it can also obviously be a source of disruption. But I think it does many times, and I think that it's much needed at the moment. Is my impression.
It's nice to think of the novel as sort of disruptive, because I sometimes feel like we're in an age where there's a lot of rhetoric around reading as being like sort of really good for you, or it's like part of a healthy diet, or it makes you a better person, and I almost feel like, I know people want to share their love of reading, and that's great, but I almost feel like in a sense that diminishes what you're describing, Katharina, which is also like the sort of disruptive power of the novel and the subversive power of the novel, and the novel is something that can be sort of quite uncomfortable and challenging. And I think what's really nice to see in fiction at the moment is I think there's quite an emphasis on that. Like that's what it feels like to me. It's like what can the novel do? Like you're saying, Sam, like what are its possibilities? Like what does it bring to the modern world? What does it offer? And I personally think that's really valuable thing. Like I'm glad we're keeping sight of that.
Do you also hate the woolly socks and the coffee cups on Instagram?
Yeah.
I just hate that. I was like, no, because I think you can, with a novel, you can really get to people, I think. And like you got to me with your novel. I was just like,
yeah,
wow.
Yeah.
And it's something I don't really like. It's this kind of novels being portrayed as something that always needs to reaffirm your worldviews, it's like something that's cozy, because I don't think it should be cozy. I think it should also upset people, and the way it's packaged sometimes is a bit problematic, I think. But as you say, at the moment there's a lot of stuff out there that I think has a potential to disrupt. So
it's always a difficult pitch as a bookseller, I think, saying this is going to make you feel horrible, it's going to reset your brain. I think, and the question I'd always dread most is, what I want an uplifting read, and I kind of feel like saying, you're in the wrong place, I'm afraid.
Yeah, I think you can't recommend our books for that.
Yeah. Well, sometimes I recommend something and I think afterwards I remember what it was actually about. You only remember the feeling that you have after you finished it sometimes. Do you know what I mean? The feeling of having read it and kind of what you've had, what you've taken away from it, but then realize what the content of the story is, and you think, yeah, but I don't think they're going to be coming back to ask for another recommendation. So, but yeah, it's true. I think it's exciting. I think it's an exciting time. I think that kind of all to play for. I think people are paying attention to the novel. I certainly feel that way in the shop a lot more than people have been. People kind of come wide-eyed and want to talk about it. So I think it's good. It's going to be quite exciting when we're allowed to do that again, and to see what people have experienced with books for the last 12 months or what have you.
And it's going to be really interesting to see what people want of their art over the next year or two as well. I think, because we've been through this unprecedented sort of experience of like global trauma and like global grief, and at some point that's going to have to be processed, and I always feel that it very often falls to artists across all disciplines to sort of begin doing the work of of processing these things. But I also feel like this year it might be too soon for people to be processing too much of that stuff, and so there might be a period when I'm interested to see how long the period is now going to be before people want to sort of almost return to last year and say, like, okay, what have we experienced? What has it been that has happened?
And it's also so interesting because it's a collective experience, right? I think that's what makes it so interesting. And how we're going to process it. Because if you ask me now, do you want to read a novel about lockdown? I'll be like, get the fuck out of here. That's what makes it so interesting to me, is like, how are we going to approach it? And how are we going to render it in any kind of art and films? Are we going to see people with masks on? Are we going to see all of that? I don't know. I'm really interested. But I think you're right. It'll probably take a little while.
Well, we haven't got any questions from the audience, so I'm just going to assume that's because you've answered them all, and there's nothing left for anyone to ask. Or perhaps, we shouldn't be demanding people to ask questions on our kind of on our time, and they'll occur later. But it kind of just leaves to me to say thanks very much for coming to Burley Fisher Books virtually tonight, and for it's a really fascinating discussion. And it will be available for people to watch afterwards in their own time.
Brilliant. Thanks for having us. Thanks so much.
Yeah, thank you very much. It was great. I had fun.
Pleasure. And I always got to say, as a bookseller, both books are available from Burley Fisher Books. So please come and see us virtually online if you haven't managed to read either Katarina or Sam's books, because they're both brilliant. Thanks, guys.